Hey there, my name is Justin. In this one, I'm going to show you how to integrate Python with Airtable. It's incredibly easy, and if you stay till the end, you'll actually see how to use environment variables to keep your code a little bit more secure. So let's go ahead and jump in. All right, so we're going to be using Python to run this integration to Airtable. Now, I'm going to be using Python version 3.6, but as you see, Python 3.9 is out. And you can use any version of Python just so long as it supports Python requests. So this is the third-party package we'll use to actually do the integration. Really, really cool package, and it makes all of this stuff a lot easier to accomplish, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And of course, make sure that you have an Airtable account, so airtable.com. They're not sponsoring this or anything. I would love for them to sponsor my content. But if you click the link in the description, I at least get credit for you signing up with Airtable if you don't already have an account. So let's go ahead and actually look at Airtable first. We'll start here to see generally what it is that we're trying to do. And the gist of it is to store our data in a database of some kind, right? That's essentially what Airtable is. It's a database. Think of it like an Excel spreadsheet that your actual Python program can access, but also other people can access as well. It's a lot more user-friendly than a web application database or a more production-grade developer database like Postgres or MySQL. So let's go ahead and add a base, and I'm going to go ahead and start from scratch. Now, the reason I'm starting from scratch is because, well, I actually want to define what kind of data I'm going to collect. Now, this data can be anything, right? It's completely up to you. As long as you can store it in a database, Airtable is probably going to work. So this one, I'm going to call this py-2 Airtable, right? So that's actually the name of my base, but not the name of my table. So I want to rename the table to table-1. Now, the reason I'm using lowercases and dashes is because it's a little bit more user-friendly when it comes to writing code. We'll see this in a little bit, but the main thing is to think about like URLs. So if I go to google.com and do / this is not a real URL, notice that there's spaces in there and everything. If I hit enter, you start to see these %20 things. So that is a very common thing for the internet to have happen. So that's why I actually want to use the lowercase and dash. Because if I use lowercase and dash in the same fashion, like google.com / table-1, it no longer changes anything about that text. Obviously, it's not found. It's on a real URL. It's meant to kind of take a look at what's happening when we name these things. It's kind of good to know about that. Okay, so I don't need an overview of this at all. That's not really the point here. But what I do want is I'm going to lowercase name and uppercase something called email, right? So I'm going to have two fields in here of name and email. And I'm going to get rid of these other ones. I don't need the attachment field or the status field. Now, if you've never used Airtable before, hopefully this looks a lot like an Excel spreadsheet or a number spreadsheet or a Google sheet. That's essentially what it is. That's basically how we're going to be storing our data. It's much like a spreadsheet. So something like Justin and abc@notreal.com, right? So that is what we want to do. We want to actually be able to collect those kinds of things. I did name these differently on purpose, but I still want to follow the convention of having a dash instead of a space at the very least, right? Capitalization is something we'll have to consider as well. But that's essentially what I want to do. I want Python to actually add this data for me. It's really not that complicated. But now that we've got this, let's go ahead and set up the Python portion of it. And I'm going to be using, first I'll use my actual terminal window. So if you're on Windows, you're going to be using PowerShell, and you want to navigate into some sort of directory or folder that actually has nothing in it, right? It's made for what we're doing here. In this case, I just have it in this directory. If you're on Windows, it's just dir. That will show you what directory you're working in. And if you list everything out, you won't see anything in there. That's kind of the key here. And now I'm going to be using Python 3.6, and we'll use -m for module venv. This is a virtual environment. This is going to make sure that all of the version dependencies that our project has stays in one place, right? It's not perfect, but it definitely works pretty well. So if you're confused about that at all, let me know in the comments. I also have stuff in the description to go in more depth on setting up virtual environments in addition to just setting up Python. Anyway, so let's go ahead and do this with that period at the end, so it actually creates it in the exact same directory that I'm in or same folder that I'm in, and I want to activate it. So source bin/activate, and if you're on Windows, it's /scripts/activate. Very, very similar, just slightly different. So this is Mac and Linux users do source bin/activate. Cool, so now that I've got this, if I do something called pip freeze, I'll see, well, nothing installed. Now, if this doesn't work for you, you can do Python 3.6, or since I'm in a virtual environment, I can just type out Python, and I can do -m pip freeze, and that will show you the exact same thing, right? So when in doubt, put Python-m in front of it, and then try and use whatever that module might be. So simply, we just need to do Python-m pip install requests. This will install that Python request library that we need to use. Now, of course, you could do pip install request, just that command. That should work just fine. And again, the Python version I'm using in here, Python-V, is 3.6.8. Every once in a while, you'll see to upgrade pip. You might as well do that. Every once in a while, that is a good thing to do, but it's not entirely required for this to work. So the main thing now is we need to create a Python module to actually do our integration. So how do we go about doing this integration? In other words, how do we call a REST API that is hosted by Airtable? Well, to do this, I actually go Airtable REST API docs. Right? That's literally what I'll search for any kind of service, right? You say the service name and REST API docs. I'll explain that in a moment. But if we click on this, we see that they've got these REST API documentation. Now, I'm already logged in, so it actually shows me the workspace that I have. If you're not logged in, you're not going to see that. It's probably going to recommend that you do log in. So if we click on this, it's going to give me some documentation. Now, the reason we actually started the project first is because this allowed for our documentation to be a little bit more tailored to what we're trying to do, right? So it gives us the ID of this base and all that. I don't need to worry about that just yet. What I want to worry about is the table-1 table. Okay, so what the heck is that, right? Well, if I go back in here and rename my table again, so let's go ahead and rename the table. This time I'm going to go ahead and say pi-2 Airtable 1. Okay, so I just renamed the table and I go in the docs and refresh things here. Now it says pi-2 Airtable 1, right? So the documentation for Airtable is really cool because it shows us these changes. Not all documentation is like that, unfortunately. So it makes it really easy to develop with their API, which is no surprise because they want people developing for their API. Okay, so if I go down here and actually click on that table, I see a bunch of things that seem maybe confusing. Depends on your level of familiarity with working with a REST API. This might be confusing, but the main thing that we're looking at here is creating records, as in we want to add records into the database that is Airtable, or really this sheet right here, this base, this table. I mean, there's a lot of ways to name these things, but basically I want to add a field in here that's often referred to as create. So we're going to go ahead and create a record in here using Python requests. Now this is actually a little bit confusing because this doesn't have Python code here. This has something called curl. What is curl? Well, curl is a way to call a URL on the command line, right? So if you're on a Mac or Linux and you're inside a terminal, if you're on a Windows and you're inside a PowerShell, you'll see this error or some sort of error to have you call a URL, right? And this is the URL right here. Might be hard to see because it's purple, but the idea here is we can now copy this, and I'm going to go into my text editor. In this case, I'm using VS Code, and I'm going to write my first thing, and I'll just call it main.py, and I'll paste in, I'll call this an endpoint, and we'll set it equal to that string, okay? So this is the actual URL that I want to use, but there's a couple things to note here. This right here and this right here. Now, it's a good chance that yours does not say the exact same thing as this. Actually, it probably doesn't. But the thing that might be the same if you've been renaming everything like I have is pi-2 Airtable. Incredibly easy and incredibly useful, but can be a little tricky if you're not sure what you're looking at. So let's actually go back to the introduction. Now, most people don't read this stuff. I skim through it. But what we see here is the ID of this base is this. So I'm going to go ahead and say Airtable base ID, and I'm going to put that in there. Okay. So I use capitalized things when they are going to be environment variables. Again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But for now, this is the base ID for my Airtable. Whatever that means, that's what it is. But I see that this and this are the exact same thing. So I can replace it with that variable using an f-string substitution, right? So that's built into Python 3.6 and above. That's a really easy way to do string substitution in Python. The next thing is, of course, this py to Airtable 1. Now, remember how we changed the name of it? Well, let's change it again. And this time I'll just rename the table and get rid of that 1 in there, as well as that trailing dash. Okay, so now it's just py to Airtable. If I refresh in here, I now see that it says py to Airtable or py to Airtable. And if I look at that same curl URL on any of them, it now doesn't have that 1 there, right? So going back to create records, it now does not have that -1 there. So this shows me another thing, and that is Airtable table name, right? So that table name in my case is py to Airtable. And we change this out. Now you might be wondering, why am I doing this? Hopefully you are wondering that. Well, the reason being is now, if you took this stuff right here and changed your values, this endpoint is now the correct endpoint for what we need to do. That's it. That's literally the only reason for that. So there's the next step is we see this authorization. So whenever you see curl and -h, that means header. Now this can be confusing from time to time, but I'll try and make it as clear as possible. So the header is a key value pair store. So when I say key, I mean authorization : that is our key. The value is bearer and your API key. So the key is the authorization. The next key for the next header is content type and application JSON. So that means in here, I can come in and say well, let's just use headers. And I'm using lowercase on purpose. I'll show you why in a moment. And the first one was authorization. And then this string right here. Okay, so this is actually how we will write our headers specifically for Python requests headers. Okay. Next thing is we use content type and application JSON. Okay. So key is content type and the value is application JSON. Okay, so far we've finished these 3 lines here. We haven't touched what this is, but we've done these 3 right here. Next is data. Okay, so data is, well, let's look at data. I'm actually going to copy and paste in between these strings. So from this quote to this quote. And I'm going to copy that whole thing. And what I'm going to do is replace my dictionary values here. Okay, so this is now that data. And it's pretty much the exact same. There is one slight difference, but we'll talk about that once we actually run it. So I'm really close to being able to do a request. And we see this post here, right? And if we look at another kind of value, so like retrieve a record, we actually don't see any post there. There's nothing in there. If we see update a record, we see another one called patch, so -x patch. And then delete, we see -x delete. So these are called HTTP methods. So HTTP methods. And what we need to ask ourselves is, what is the method for create? And this is typically post. And that's all capitals, post, right? That's typically what that HTTP method is. Now, when I say HTTP method, I mean like when we go to a web page, so like youtube.com, I'm actually getting that web page. I'm requesting it. My HTTP method is get, right? If I'm trying to update something or create a record, Creating a record would be post, as in, hey, I just made a new account, I'm posting data there. So that can get a little confusing from time to time, but when we're looking for posting, when we want to add data, just when in doubt, use post. Okay, so when we're updating, creating records and all that. So now we'll go ahead and use Python requests. So I'll go ahead and import requests. Now remember, I actually already installed this into that virtual environment. Now that I'm in VS Code, I'm going to go ahead and do source bin/activate. This will actually create that virtual environment activated in my VS Code app. But of course, if you're using a different text editor, you can just flip back to the terminal and you can do a pip freeze in here, and we should still see that Python requests in there. And if we list everything out, we see main.py in here as well. Okay, so with imports, you typically don't put them at the bottom. You put them at the very top, something like this. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is actually run a request. And we want r equals to requests.post. Well, you might want to do capital, but it's actually lowercase with Python request. This is just a convenient way to post data. Then we pick our endpoint, we add our data, and we add our headers. And in fact, this is JSON data, so we can say JSON equals to that data dictionary. Okay, so I know it's JSON because of application/JSON. JSON is just a different data type. Okay, so now that we've got this, we need to actually declare our actual endpoint, which I did capitalized here. I don't need to do that anymore. I can leave it in as a lowercase, because these are really the environment variables that I want specifically for my app, and I want those to change in just a little bit. So now with this, I'm going to go ahead and print out r.json. So I'm going to print out what the response is, and specifically the JSON data. If you did it incorrectly, you might need to print out r.text. But let's try r.json. Okay, so really simple. We do Python Python main.py. So we are calling this Python module, and if it's successful, we should see some cool stuff happen. Python main.py, authentication required. What the heck? I thought I did the authentication headers. That's strange. If I scroll up, it says authorization, which is another way of doing authentication headers. Authorization, bearer, your API key. Uh-oh. Is that my actual API key? Well, of course it's not. That's the documentation API key. They are not going to actually expose your API key right here. You know why? Because that's not secure. That's why we need an environment variables, and that's why we'll talk about it in just a moment. But for now, we have a way to actually call this service. It failed, but it actually works, right? So it calls this URL with this table name and this base ID. So we didn't get any other kind of error. We got this error. This is actually the exact error we want. So what is our API key then? Well, this is actually simple as well. So we'll go ahead and do Airtable API key, and we'll set that equal to a string as well. Right now we had it in as your API key, which I'll leave it for a moment. And then I'll do some string substitution inside of the header itself. So now it's the exact same value as it was, but was using string substitution and some of our values right here. So let's go ahead and find this API key. First, of course, I can test this code to make sure I don't have any syntax errors or anything like that. And I'm actually getting the authentication require error still, which of course I am. So now let's get that API key. What is an API key? Well, if we go back into our Airtable account, and even if you're not in the actual table itself, like if you're just on airtable.com and you've logged in, you just click on your little icon up here, go to account, and look for API and generate API key. Now, I will say there's a really high certainty or a really high chance that this will change location in the future. Like the actual API key will change. And there's also a chance that using API keys will change as well. So be sure to know about that. If it does change, let me know in the comments, because maybe I can do an update to this video. So we're going to go ahead and generate this API key. And this API key, we can regenerate it as many times as we want. But keep in mind, if you do change this API key, it's going to break things. We'll see that in a moment. So I actually want to copy it. I just copy it by clicking into it, copy that up, and let's go back into our code and put in our API key here. Right? So right now, this is a really insecure way to write our code because the actual key is in our Python file. But while we're learning, it's completely okay. But in general, we don't want to do this. Okay. So now that I've got this, let's go ahead and save everything, of course, and run python main.py, hit enter. What do you know? It actually added some records, and that's what my JSON response was. It gives me a created time. It shows me the fields. It does give me a response of a successful response. Now, I know it's successful also because if you print out R status underscore code, this will also show you either a 200 or a 201. And if we run that, we see a 200. Anything in the range of 200 to 299 is a success. If I change the API key, or rather, let's go ahead and regenerate the API key, and actually, now that old API key, this one right here, is no longer valid. So if I run this again, now what I'll get is a 401. So anything between 400 and 499 is an invalid key. So you can look up HTTP status codes for this. There's a really good Wikipedia article on that. But the main thing is we now no longer have access. So again, I need to use this new key and change it in here. And now let's go ahead and run python main.py. Boom, get another 200 response. That's what we wanted. But now what we really want is actually take a look at our database. And what do you know? All of these new entries are in here. And if I run it again, we're going to get some more entries in here. Cool. But this is only part of the battle. I actually want this to be a bit more effective. And I don't want the data coming directly from this, right? This is a hard-coded data. I want my users to be able to input this data, or somewhere in my app to input this data. So how do we go about doing that? Well, of course, we turn all of this stuff into some sort of function. And that's what I'll do now. So I'll go ahead and define add to Airtable. Okay, so I'm going to give it an email being none and a name being an empty string. Okay, so we'll say if email is none, then we'll just go ahead and return this. Otherwise, well, we just want to grab all of this same data. So I'm going to go ahead and cut all of these things out. I'm going to comment them out for the code as reference for you for later. This will be, of course, on GitHub. Check the description in the bottom to see exactly how that's executed. But anyway, so now that we've got this stuff in here, let's come back in. I have the exact same headers, so still that Airtable API key for the authorization header. Now the data, well, we see these fields in here. I can actually come in here and change one of these fields to being email. And the name, of course, being the argument of name. Okay. And now I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the extra one in here. So this block, and that goes from this right here, get rid of that, and that right there. Okay, so I'm going to tab these things in a little bit just so it's easier to see what's going on. So we've got a list with a dictionary, and inside of that dictionary we have fields and key value pairs in here. So now we've got our data, and we have a request.post, and we now have this add to Airtable method in here. And we can just call this, and I'll do abc123 at fake.com, and I'll say name equals to jmitch. Okay, cool. So now that we've got this, let's go ahead and run it again and hit python main.py. It ran. If I come back into Airtable, I now see that that one worked. Sweet. Now, of course, we could do this even further and say email equals to raw, or rather input, and say what is your email, and do a new line for that one, and then name, what is your name, and then pass these arguments directly into this function. So we save that, and let's run it again. Now, what is your email? abc12 or whatever at notreal.com, and Justin Mitchell, and I hit enter, go back into Airtable. Whoa, how cool is that? I think that's pretty cool. Really, really easy thing to do. Now, of course, Airtable itself has all of these features that after you add this data, maybe you trigger all sorts of other automations, which also is cool. But even just as a bare minimum database of some kind that anyone on our team can go in and grab, That was really easy. But here is the kicker. This is something that you want to make sure that everyone on your team that's not technical, even if you aren't that technical yourself, you want to make sure that nobody changes what these values are. Because if I rename this field, let's rename the email field to lowercase, which I actually prefer. I really like using lowercase or slugified versions. When I say slugified, I mean it's all lowercase and there's a dash for spaces. So if we change it to a lowercase and I run this again, what is your email? abc@gmail.com, not real. Justin, hit enter. I get a 422, right? So this actual error is because it doesn't actually know of this uppercased field of email. So if I change it back to just email and run this again and do abcworking@work.com and now my name of Justin again and hit enter, this should actually give me a 200 response, and that's what it prints out. And so that's what we see in our Airtable now. So that's the last kind of critical piece on getting all of this to work. So what do you think? Pretty simple, pretty doable. I know I went kind of fast in some cases. Some of you, this is like a lot of review to just execute something that's fairly simple. Others, this is like a huge stretch. I totally get that. And I think it's important to stretch yourself with these things. And I speak fast so you can rewatch it and get it done really, really quick. Okay, so there is one more thing that I want to do, and that is putting all of these things into environment variables instead of into the hard-coded key here. Now, what are environment variables? Well, when you actually deploy your applications into a production service, a lot of times what you'll do is you'll store things into environment variables. So if I import OS and do os.environ, I can actually see all of the default environment variables that my system has. There's a lot, okay? So let's go ahead and exit that out. And another way that you can add environment variables is to actually put them in front of your application, okay? So in front of your Python call. Now, I am not positive if this works really well on Windows, but I will solve this problem in just a moment through code, not through commands like this. Because I actually don't like doing commands like this either. I don't think this is a very good way to do it. So basically, you can actually put the value like this and then Python, then call Python and main.py. That will actually add that environment variable into main.py, which we can see by changing this API key, or let's just print it out first. I'll go ahead and import OS up here, and then we'll do os.environ.get and this Airtable API key, right? So again, this is the one I'm declaring right here. It is not this one. Okay, and we can even just comment this out just to feel comfortable about this. Okay, so I want to print this one out. So it's printing out the environment variable of that. If I press up and hit enter, I see it. Okay, so this is one way to use environment variables inside of an application. Because now, if I actually put this on GitHub or a lot of other places, I can actually just tell them, hey, you need to run it with the Airtable API key in front. But this is actually not the method that most developers use these days, especially Python developers. We use something called a .env file. So .env inside of our application, there it is right there, right? Literally a dot in front of it. And what we do is we actually grab all of these keys in here and paste them in just like that. Okay. And then instead of it hard coded in here, we use the same os.environ.get, right? So os.environ.get of each one of these environment variables. Now, I often use them the same way, which is the same name as the environment variable I often use as the actual Python variable. In other words, let me just delete this, or I'll leave that for a moment. So in other words, this variable is the Python variable. This variable is the environment variable, which is a lot of words there. But if I called this base ID, now the Python variable does not match the environment variable, right? It's just slightly different. So I think it's a really good practice to use both of them to match because it's a lot easier to diagnose problems when they both match. You can rename them again later if you needed to for some reason, but I think this is a really good way to do that, and it's very common to keep these things capitalized with underscores instead of dashes for spaces. These are best practices, so just get used to these kind of things. A little fun, a little not. Okay, so now if I run python main.py, I should get none, right? So this is actually giving me a none value, meaning it's not actually loading these environment variables. But I have this .env file. Why not? Well, part of that is because we don't have a way for Python to automatically read these things. So if you're going into production, like let's say, for instance, you're deploying an application on Heroku or Google Cloud or AWS, there's a lot of times there's a way to actually set your environment variables for that application. You can set these literally to what these values are. So the key being Airtable base ID, the value being this. But when you're developing locally, well, it just doesn't work that way unless you do something like this, or you install another package, which in our case, we're going to use pip install python-.env. Now, do keep in mind that this is not the version for Django. So those of you who watch Django stuff, this is a completely different version. So let's go ahead and do pip install python-.env. And with this, we will actually load in our .env in here. Now, the cool thing about this is it's really smart. So if the .env file is not there, it will ignore this loading, which is really cool. So I'll show you that in just a moment. So from .env, we're going to import load_.env, and then we'll just call that load.env. Okay. So this automatically looks for a file in here called .env. That's in the same path or right next to main.py. If it's somewhere else like source / that's just a quick and easy way to do that. But let's go ahead and use .env as our default. So we'll save this. And now when I run this, it should actually give me the environment variable from our .env file itself. So I run that, and there it is, right? So again, if I actually had a different name for .env, if I rename this to, let's say, .env2, and I run this again, it gives me none again. But if I go in main.py and change it to .env2, what do you know? It actually still works, right? So load.env is really cool, but if you don't pass anything in there, it will go off of just simply .env. So now what you have is the ability to execute this code locally with different environment variables than what you may have here. Okay, so the main thing about this is actually testing it in real time. Like actually change, let's like change our API key, for example, right? So I'm going to go ahead and call this method again like I was doing, which was just add to Airtable with my hard-coded information. So abc-1234 whatever at gmail.com and not real. Okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and change my Airtable API key. And this is where the security comes in. This is where we want to think in terms of being as secure as possible, especially for low-code solutions like this. So I come into my account and I regenerate this API key. So my old environment variable or my old API key should not work anymore. So if I call it, going back into VS Code, opening up the terminal with Control tilde or Control tilde should work on both systems or all systems. Now I run it, I get a 401, permissions not allowed. So let's go ahead and grab that new API key, go into .env, save that one, run it again. Now I get a 200. It is printing out that API key. I don't want to do that actually, because again, when it comes to secret keys and API keys and things you want to keep hidden, you don't want to print them out in your production grade service either. But I did that just so we can see it working. And of course, we're getting that 200, and we can confirm that in the actual table itself as well. So we go back into that table, and we see all of this cool stuff. Sweet. Really, really easy, right? I mean, there's a lot of steps to get here, but once you actually have these steps and you understand this context, you can now just use this single function to update or add things to Airtable, right? Really, really simple. So what I actually like to do with this one is I just like to return a Boolean value, so status code equaling to 200. This I've noticed is the success value based off of what I've been doing. So I want to make sure this is a true or false value. So this will just tell me that, hey, this was added correctly or not, right? That's it, which I think is important when you're trying to build stuff. So if I run this again, oops, not 3 equals. I've been doing too much JavaScript lately. Just 2 equals, and now we should get a true or false value if we actually printed out that add to Airtable call. And of course, you could reference this in the future and use it at any time, just knowing that the .env stuff is critical. All right, so now you know how to integrate Python with Airtable. It's actually pretty easy to do. Granted, it took a little over 30 minutes, but that's because I gave you all of the possible context I could to make this happen. But the thing is, you're now left with, well, how do I actually extract that data using Python? That, I think, is a really good challenge for you. If you stick around, what I'm actually going to be showing you next is how to integrate this into a fast API web application. That is actually using a web interface and a web form instead of the command line interface here. It's actually also pretty simple to do, but it takes a little bit more work to actually get that all set up. So make sure you subscribe to get that one. I will have a link to that video in the description as well as here once it's actually up. So hopefully it's up by the time you're watching this, but it might not be depending on when you actually see this one. Now, if you don't have an Airtable account, like I mentioned before, click that link in the description. I get credit for it, and that way I can convince Airtable to work with me. Hey, Airtable, if you're there, come work with me. Anyways, thanks again for watching, you guys. Hope to see you next time.